Welcome to the History Book Buffs. I'm Antonia Senior, I'm a writer and a journalist, and I'm joined in this endeavour to bring you all the best history books, fact and fiction, by the award-winning historian Roger Moorhouse. In this episode, Roger and I are talking mainly about Richard Overy's brilliant new book, Reign of Ruin, about the American bombing campaign in Japan at the end of World War II. We'll also be bringing you our top 3 books about nuclear Armageddon, fact and fiction. Let us know if you think we got it right. Subscribe, follow, talk to us. And ask yourself the question that we ask each other. Would you have pressed the button? What are we reading this week? What are you reading?
Well, I've picked up, on the strength of a very nice review, I picked up Oliver Moody, The Baltic, which is I've just started, which is really interesting about the whole history of the region and its significance, kind of geopolitically at the moment, which is, you know, we are at one of those tipping points in history, as it were. And I think the Baltic and all of those countries, particularly Poland as well, is one of those areas that's going to become increasingly significant.
Okay.
So that's looking very interesting.
Sounds good.
What about you?
So I'm reading a novel by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I think I said that right.
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah, and it's absolutely brilliant. Dream Counts, it's her new one. I've read everything she's ever written.
Yeah.
I buy her like in hardback with my own money on the day that it comes out.
With your own money.
With my own money.
I mean, that's the recommendation right there.
I know, and it's amazing. You would love it, Moorhouse. There's so much that's brilliant about it, and lots of menstruation and childbirth.
Wonderful. I mean, it's always what I'm looking for in a novel. Yeah, frankly.
That's it. Yeah, it's about the interconnected lives of 4 Nigerian women.
Okay.
Some of whom live in America and some of whom don't. It's wonderful. She's
one
amazing.
of those that sort of spans the globe and spans the centuries, is it or not?
Not the centuries, but yeah, it's right. It manages to encapsulate quite a lot about kind of Nigerian history and the experience of being an American immigrant and menstrual blood. So all good.
What more do you want?
Right. Anyway, leaving menstrual blood aside, we're not talking about these books this week. We are talking about the brilliant Richard Overy and his fantastic new book,
Reign of Ruin, which is, I think, is fantastic. I love Richard Overy anyway. I mean, I've read probably everything that he's actually written.
You're a Richard Overy superfan.
I am, actually. I am. You know, and I have to say, you know, he's also, I know him a bit, and he is a lovely man. He's genuinely a lovely guy. So.
Hang on, you're not doing one of those recommend a friend books?
No, not at all. No, I don't know him that well that I would do that. But, you know, I mean, it shouldn't make a difference, but it kind of does, that. You know, that he's genuinely a, you know, very generous and nice man. So, and, you know, the most important thing, brilliant historian, writes well. He does have, you know, on this one, we're talking here about, he talks about the bombing of Japan. So it's not just, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although I suppose you might imagine that was the main theme. But he talks as well about the firebombing of Japan and says actually one of the sort of main themes of the book is how the firebombing of Japan was pretty much as destructive as the atomic bombing, and certainly in terms of the decision leading to the Japanese decision to surrender, is arguably more influential than the atomic bombing, which is kind of interesting because I think the conventional, certainly the popular narrative, is that, you know, it was the atomic bombing that sort of, you know, propelled Japan towards surrender. It was like the final straw. We can't do this. But the reality, and what he does brilliantly, is just to switch the perspective. Looks a lot at, you know, contemporary Japanese accounts, and especially the discussions taking place in government and with the emperor and so on, where by looking at it from that perspective, you can see actually that the atomic bombing was much less significant than it has subsequently become in the narrative and in the historiography, and crucially in the American narrative of events. So if you look at it from the Japanese perspective, they didn't really know. Like the bombing of Hiroshima, for example, they didn't quite know what had happened, right? Because it wasn't kind of, we have this idea now that, information is immediate. That is not the case in 1945, obviously. So they didn't quite know what Hiroshima was.
So they didn't know it was an atomic bomb because they didn't know such a thing.
Exactly.
And then it dropped on there.
Yeah. So the decision making and then the decision to surrender actually falls between the two bombings, between Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision is made on the morning of Nagasaki, but before the bomb was dropped, right?
Oh, so could it have gone another way if they'd surrendered, if they'd given their decision to the Americans earlier with Nagasaki?
Potentially. But what's interesting is that the way he describes it is that there are various other factors. The Russians had just come in, Soviets had just come in. They just invaded.
Hang on, can we back up 1 minute? Just to start, just to go back. So when does the book start? It starts just at the end of the American-Japanese War, doesn't it?
Let's wind it back. So he basically encapsulates it as, the American bombing of Japan.
Yeah.
So it actually starts with, mentions the Doolittle raid, which is, I think, 42.
Yeah.
And then there was sort of, they had bases in China, for example, where they used to hop over the Himalayas and had this massive supply operation to get bombs and fuel and all the rest of it, munitions, into those bases to then be able to reach Japan. So the whole logistical challenge of actually bombing Japan at all is really, really interestingly delineated in the book as well. So it's actually slightly broader. One point to make is that it's a pleasingly short book. I do like a short book. Time is short, Senior. So, I do like a short book. And even like most of Overy's books are pretty big. He doesn't sort of scrimp in that sense. But this is a nice short book. So he's actually covering quite a lot in that time.
But partly the reason it's a short book is there's not huge amounts of original research in this, is there? It's a wonderful book, but it's a kind of synthesis of
I think it is.
But
I think importantly that that shift of perspective is significant, because it allows him to bring novelty to the argument without necessarily having, reams and reams of original material. So
the timeline is they're kind of trying to launch these bombing raids, and then they basically launch these way before Hiroshima, they launch these extraordinary firebombing. Yeah. There's a word for it, isn't it? That they use it in Germany as well. What's the technical term for these kind of indiscriminate bombing raids?
Area bombing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly, the Americans were really critical of the British for what they were doing in Europe, because they always described, the British used to bomb by night. It developed into, it was supposed to be reasonably targeted, but you just can't do it. I mean, you can't do it with the technology of the time, and especially the British bombing at night. It was effectively indiscriminate, right? Yeah. And the Americans were very keen to criticise that as far as what the British were doing, because they used to bomb by day, and they claimed it was much more precise. But then what they're doing in Japan, pretty much at the same time, if you remember, Dresden is the middle of February 45. The middle of March 45 is the firebombing of Tokyo, which is massive. I mean, in terms of, and the death toll is every bit comparable as the atomic bombing later in August, which is kind of important. I think we kind of forget that. And he makes the point that actually the conventional firebombing of Tokyo from March is as significant in terms of the political developments, in terms of the sense that the government and the emperor had that potentially they're looking at social unrest as a result of all of this.
He was very interesting, I thought, on the way the Americans managed the morality of doing these area bombing campaigns. They're so gorgeous, wasn't he? So I think he said that in Tokyo, part of the reason they justified it to themselves was because Japanese industry wasn't kind of concentrated in these big industrial areas like German industry was. It was kind of threaded throughout Tokyo. So therefore...
So it justified area bombing.
Because...
And to some extent, I think that, again, there's a grain of truth to that, because it was, from the earlier bombing phase, they had sort of dissipated to some extent their industrial production. So, there was a grain of truth there, but there's a much bigger grain of self-justification, I would say.
And they do quite a sort of targeted job at othering the Japanese as well. I hate that phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway. At kind of making it very clear that the Japanese are quite robust, shall we say, in the way they wage warfare, and therefore you can be robust back.
Yeah, and that's I think that's an interesting angle that, you know, that slightly relativizing sort of morality between how the Americans viewed, like, as I said, what the British were doing against Germany at the time, and then what they're doing against Japan. I think more modern historians, perhaps, than us, would probably frame that as straight up racist. I would suggest. So I think there's a strong element of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. What the Americans thought that the Japanese weren't kind of.
Yeah, that you know, they weren't in a sense like us. You know, there wasn't that element. You know, Germany, I mean, obviously had a very strong. There's sort of familial ties. There's historic ties between Germany and the US. Whatever had happened, obviously, to you know, with the outbreak of war and so on, those ties were still there. And then Japan, well, for generations, othered itself. Let's be honest. You know, it always set itself apart. So there is a degree of that othering. And as I say, I think you could go so far as to say there's a big dose of racism in that as well.
The accounts of the firebombing of Tokyo are quite strong. I mean, my gosh, this is not an easy read.
It's not, but actually, I think he actually deals with that in a rather, I don't know, sort of careful way, certainly a kind of academic way. Yeah. You know, but he's a brilliant academic, and that sort of academic tone is in the book, if you like. I think if you or I had written that book, it would be considerably bloodier.
There'd be a lot more weeping children.
There would be a lot more weeping children. So if you're looking for, you know, grisly eyewitness accounts of, you know, the aftermath of Hiroshima, I mean, he probably does like literally a paragraph, whereas you or I would do pages. I mean, just would, because in a sense that, you know, that it's just a question of style and viewpoint and all the rest of it. He's being, you know, very academic, very kind of rigidly objective. So where it has, you know, a purpose to his narrative, which is that it, you know, it was provoking social unrest and so on, political unrest, then he puts it in there. But there's nothing gratuitous about it at all. Yeah. And that's one thing you know, even if I was doing it, you know, joking apart, it would be a lot bloodier. It would be a lot more eyewitness stuff. But then that's the difference of perspective.
But I didn't think he needed it, because I think your imagination can fill in the gaps quite happily. Because he does lay out quite sort of explicitly the extent of how horrific this is. And tell us about, you know, how does he? So he then moves from Tokyo to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How does he kind of handle the dropping of the bomb and the moral qualms or otherwise around? Yeah,
one of the interesting angles of this is how, as you said before, how the Americans justified the bombing to themselves, and then the sort of narrative around it. So he goes through that whole process of how that fed into the surrender thinking of the Japanese. And interestingly, that, like he says, they didn't even have a word for surrender. Like it was sort of cessation of conflict or whatever it was, however it was phrased. But they didn't even have a word for it. It was that kind of controversial to even mention surrender. So it's how they kind of mentally got around it. So those two conflicting narratives, if you like, of how the bombing played into or didn't into the surrender decision. And then there's this, he has a final section where he talks about the aftermath, which is quite interesting, and how the Americans essentially created the narrative. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary evils, for one thing. Initially, and initially as well, there was a sort of active cover-up of the real effects of this. You know, the radiation poisoning, for example, which they were very keen in those early say months and even years after 1945 to play down and say, actually, it wasn't really as bad as it really was.
Why were they playing it down?
I think because of that question of morality, that it was troubling. So that the instinct was to try and cover it up.
I suppose if you're still killing people after you've won,
yeah,
that's a problem.
Exactly, right. And that becomes a problem. Yeah. So of course, you've got the American occupation of Japan after the war, and that's where they're most active in trying to cover up the long-term effects of the bombing, of the atomic bombing. So that's quite an interesting angle, not one that I'd really given much thought to before.
And the kind of decision making from the Americans, like no qualms.
Again, I think it was seen as a necessary evil. It was about saving American boys' lives. That's their narrative, and that's the one that, to a large extent, has remained, and that's how it still gets portrayed today.
What do you think? Is it his knowing what you know? Would you have made the same decision then, and would you make the same decision with the benefit of hindsight?
I always think with questions like this, and the same, have the same thing every year when Dresden comes around, the anniversary of Dresden, that I think kind of applying morality to war is a kind of very thorny business, and especially applying it in retrospect with 2020 hindsight is like profoundly thorny and difficult and almost a pointless exercise. I'd say, warfare is almost a morality-free zone. You have to win the war, and that means, in some cases, doing bad things along the way. Wow,
that's quite, punchy.
It is quite punchy, but I think as long as the Allied cause was right, so in a sense that overrides those lesser moral questions.
The same logic would apply if your cause was wrong, that whatever you need to do
because,
to win the war.
of course, and it did. But thankfully they lost. The side with the angels won, even if they did have to sort of collude with the devil in the process.
Yeah. Okay.
It is punchy.
I asked my kids this question the other night: would you press the button? And my 10-year-old said that she would press the button, but then she would fly on the same plane as the bomb and throw herself out after it.
Okay.
Which I thought was kind of a cool...
Right, in a sort of self-sacrificing way.
Yeah, because she was like, I wouldn't be able to live with myself, so I would just, crash down into the mushroom clouds.
I'm just obviously some sort of psychopath.
What? We know that! Tell us something new. Wow, the listeners need new information. Okay. So all in all, brilliant book. We love it.
Yeah, really, really enjoyed it. He's an absolutely top historian and did a really interesting job. And as I said, pithy.
Pithy.
Written with pith. Yeah.
Okay. Well done, Richard Overy. He
Yes,
has our
well
seal
done.
of approval. It's what he's always wanted, Roger.
I know. I'm sure he's made up with that.
Yeah, good. So on the subject of nuclear Armageddon,
Yes.
which, is a cheery one. We picked some top books, didn't we?
So you're going to do your first fiction pick of your top 3.
Yes. So I was looking for and thinking about my favourite books about nuclear Armageddon. And funnily enough, 2 of my picks were written in the sort of late 50s, early 60s, I guess, because this was the point at which it felt very
current.
Very current, very horrifying. So my first is a completely classic. Loads of you of our listeners will have read this. This is Neville Shute, his book On the Beach. Mm-hmm. So he's most famous, I guess, for A Town Like Alice, which I also adore. I love Neville Shute. But in this book, it's after a nuclear war has obliterated the Northern Hemisphere, and it's set in Australia, and it's a bunch of Australians waiting for the radioactive cloud that they know is coming to engulf them in a kind of, horror show.
Wow.
And as far as they're concerned, everything is gone. America's gone. Europe's gone. They're like the last...
It's the last outpost of humanity.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for it to come. Wow, that's a fairly grim premise right there.
Well, especially, to be fair, Moorhouse, if the last outpost of humanity is Australia...
Yes, then we're all lost.
Anyway, moving on before I, destroy all the, whatever goodwill any one Australian listener we've got has got for us, I will move on. The second book I'm going to recommend is Kurt Vonnegut.
Yes.
His book, Cat's Cradle, because... So this is a kind of, in typical Vonnegut style...
And of course, famous for Slaughterhouse-Five, which is about Dresden. So
right, exactly. So this is obviously thematically something that preoccupies him. So it is in his typical style. It's kind of a bit absurdist. It's a bit kind of dark humour. It's full of irony. It's not a realist book. It's a kind of...
Well, that's the same style as Slaughterhouse-Five then.
Yeah, but actually...
It's got like little threads of sort of fantasy through it as well.
Yeah, it's kind of got this weird made-up religion because it's kind of about where religion and morality meet the science of nuclear destruction. And there's this mad scientist who creates this kind of devastating weapon that's going to completely screw over humanity, and he doesn't see it as a moral issue at all. He sees it as a kind of mental puzzle about how one can create this. And obviously this is satirising the guys building the bombs. But one of the reasons I really like this is because there is something a bit absurd inherent in nuclear deterrence. Do you know what I mean? It's like these two sides looking at each other across the divide with the capacity to wipe each other out. I mean, it's so awful that you have to sort of find the absurdity in it because, you know, it's like the memes of two Spider-Men pulling the gun on each other or whatever. Yeah. It's so absurd.
And it did, of course, you know, develop that wonderfully apt acronym MAD.
Yeah.
Yeah, MAD. So, you know, that seems quite fitting.
Well, I mean, the whole thing is, in fact, if one stops and thinks about it too hard, you know, it's sometimes, even now, terrifying. And you think how terrifying it was when Cat's Cradle was written, which I think was in 1963, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. At which point, you know, this stuff is not... kind of speculative. It feels very real.
It's fun. I mean, you're a little bit younger than me, but
a little bit.
That weird thing is that world. You know, I can very well remember. You probably can't. It'll be, you know, a few years younger.
Nuclear panic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can remember that from the 80s. You know, there was that sort of last gasp, really, of sort of atomic panic, if you like. You know, with Protect and Survive, and you know, there was those. What was the American film? There was an American film about a nuclear strike that was made, and then there was a British one as well. I've forgotten the names of them now, but they were profoundly influential in sort of the public mind. So the 80s, we had this sort of last spasm of the nuclear fear.
I know, and then I suppose
and it's something I remember very clearly, and you know, thank God it's sort of dissipated.
Yeah, it only dissipated because of the end of the Cold War. Yeah. But now that the world is unstable.
Yeah, no, and nuclear proliferation is, you know, a reasonable consequence to draw from, you know, the American, you know, withdrawal from the outside
so Poland
world.
Launching a new program.
Yeah.
I mean, these are.
So we're going back into that world.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'll tell you about my last novel.
So enjoy it while you can.
Yeah, enjoy it while you can. Get this podcast before obliteration, because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So my last novel is Derek Robinson, who I think I will probably talk about a lot on this podcast because I love Derek Robinson. So he, I guess, is most famous for a novel that called Goshawk Squadron, set in World War I, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1971, but he lost to Saul Bellow, which I think is a tragedy.
Right.
So Derek Robinson writes books primarily about aerial warfare, but in this extraordinary realist, hyper-realist, kind of brutal way. His books are amazing. And he wrote this book called Hello Russia, Goodbye England, and it's about a Vulcan pilot called Silk, whose job is to be the second responder. So if nuclear war erupts and Britain has been obliterated, it is Silk's job to take off in his Vulcan and just basically obliterate Russia, kind of, you know, in retribution, because Britain's gone.
Yeah.
And what's so
but then he's got nowhere to land, presumably.
I think it's a while since I've read it that there are sort of escape routes. So I think he then goes off and lands
Australia.
in probably, or like some random Polynesian island where he just sits and kind of, you know,
could be worse.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because one of the things that I adore about Derek Robinson is how sort of amoral his books are. Like, so his characters do not dwell on the morality of it all. Silk does not dwell on the morality of it all, but, you know, because he just loves the fact he gets to fly a Vulcan, which is a really, really cool plane.
Yeah. Iconic is the word. Absolutely iconic.
I know, right? They're amazing. Yeah. So he's just obsessed with like being a Vulcan pilot, and he's got, you know, various other sort of extraordinary things going on, and he's a big boozer and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, all the time, I guess, when you're reading that book, you know, as a reader, you're confronting the fact that actually his very life is a moral dilemma. Here, so you're the Vulcan pilot, Moorhouse, you know, and you know that Britain has gone. The beautiful county of Hertfordshire where you live has been razed to the ground.
Cinders and ashes.
Yeah. Tring Park is just a smouldering nuclear festering pit. I mean, is it? No. Anyway.
Let's not run with the analogy too far.
I'm not going to run. So you're in the Vulcan plane, and England's already gone.
Yeah.
Do you go and, you know, obliterate a million Russians?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I'm sorry. That's obviously my inner psychopath. We've learnt a lot today.
You didn't even hesitate. You're just like, yep.
But no, I mean, I don't know. I just joking apart though. I think. I mean, I've never been, you know, in combat or anything like that. But I think from what I've read and what I've learned, and I've interviewed a few people who've done that, and I think there's an element to which they don't have the brain space to be bothered too much about morality. You know, there's too much going on. There's too much. There's more immediate concerns, whether it's, you know, staying alive or you know, killing the enemy, or, you know, getting food or whatever it is, or staying warm. You know, basic stuff. I'm just not convinced that in those situations there's brain space for big moral questions. For some people, of course, there are. You know, some people are more switched on to that anyway, that aspect of life. But for your ordinary grunt in the trenches, or in World War II, whatever it is, I'm not convinced there's brain space. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be addressed, because in a sense that's the luxury that we have of having the time and the space and the breadth of vision to address those questions. But I'm just saying that maybe at the time it's not one that sort of looms terribly large.
But isn't there a difference between being the guy who takes out a German sniper from a trench and being the guy who presses a button on your plane to kill a million people out of effectively revenge, because it's not going to achieve anything positive?
Yeah.
There's a difference?
Yes, there is a difference.
You're still slamming that button.
I'm still hitting the button, I'll be honest. There's no faux morality here, you know.
No. Right. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm such a moral coward. and an actual coward as well. So my cat brought in a dead mouse the other day, and I literally had to hide in the bedroom and make my children deal with it.
Wow.
So I don't think these decisions are the ones that
No, you're not equipped. Exactly.
I'm not equipped.
Exactly.
But that, you know, I'm glad that other people are equipped, I think. So Roger, anyway, tell us about your non-fiction picks.
I've sort of, I suppose, cast my net a little bit more broadly than, you know, just sort of nuclear stuff. And one that sprung to mind immediately was American Prometheus, of course, the life of Robert Oppenheimer, which was the basis for the recent film Oppenheimer that everybody saw, of course. The book was...
That's it. You know, I don't watch films.
Wow. Okay.
Sorry, carry
on. The book was written by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, Pulitzer Prize winning book. It is pretty big. It's a good, 700 pages. But it tells an awful lot along the way. You got the life of Oppenheimer obviously going through, and his both sort of scientific development of him as a scientist, also his politics. Obviously, that comes through in the film if you ever bother to watch it. So kind of questionable politics, and it's actually quite remarkable that, because he was essentially a communist sympathiser. So, as many were in the 1930s and 40s in the US and elsewhere. But it makes the case it's all the more remarkable that he actually got the post that he did. Running that highly sensitive, absolutely top secret project. So it deals with all of that, through his life and the sort of the moral questions that he wrestles with as well. Really beautifully done. Not short, as I say, but beautifully done book.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, I will probably read the book before I ever see the film, but
yeah, well, that's your medium, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Next one. When we were talking about Richard Overy's book and I suppose minor, not really a gripe, but just observation that he was going quite light on the eyewitness stuff. Very good book, which would, fill that gap, is Paul Ham's Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is telling the story of those of the two atomic bombings of Japan, primarily through using first-hand accounts, using first-hand primary material on the ground, and it really doesn't sort of scrimp on the horrors. It's quite remarkable accounts in there, and they are absolutely in every sense of the word searing. It's occasionally a hard read, but it's a brilliant book.
Okay.
So it fills that gap that Overy tactically left for us.
Yeah, which I think is important. I mean, I don't think it is reasonable to turn away from the impact of these things, especially when they were done in our name.
Yes, no, I agree, and I think so. Again, my sort of slight gripe. It's gripes overstating it, but just in terms of kind of grabbing a readership, that would be the material that I would kind of go to if I were writing that book. That's the point.
Yeah.
And I can see where he's coming from. He's coming from that sort of academic tradition, sort of, rigidly objective, and you're sort of hovering over the battlefield and all of that. You don't necessarily get lost in the weeds of personal experience.
And you give everybody the numbers.
Yeah, of course.
And you do it that way. But in terms of, I guess, really personalising it.
Yeah.
I think it's often necessary to get into the personal stories.
Yeah, I think
these are the ways that people really engage with horror.
I agree. And I think in basic terms of grabbing readers and bringing them into that world, to me it's like an open goal, especially with material that is that searing, literally searing. Then it's an open goal to not to use it. So I'm kind of surprised that he's been as sparing as he has. So the Paul Ham book is a sort of antidote to that to a large extent. And then the last one actually feeds on, I was mentioning about this sort of American cover-up of, the effects of longer term effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The book is called Fallout. It's by Leslie Bloom. And it's the story of a New Yorker, or journalist for the New Yorker magazine. His name was John Hersey. And he was in Japan 45, 46 and was, trying to uncover this, the realities of the real effects of the bombing.
Yeah.
And also expose the sort of the American cover-up of that, because they wanted to, in a sense, to sort of salve their own moral conscience and so on. They wanted to minimise the hideous long-term effects of radiation poisoning in terms of how it was told to the outside world. So there is a cover-up there, and Hersey did a great job. Finally, I think the story breaks in 46 in the New Yorker, and he did a great job of exposing that against all of that, US censorship and all the rest of it. So the book is that story. It's the story of the cover-up and of the exposure by Hersey. So it's a really interesting tale.
Sounds amazing.
Very good.
I didn't know about the cover-up, I have to say.
No, exactly. It's one that I, sort of dimly aware of, but it comes out very strongly in the Overy as well.
Yeah.
But it's an important part of that narrative, and I think it leads us into that the way the Americans themselves, I think, morally wrestled with the consequences of the bombing, the whole question of the bombing, which is an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, that all sounds completely fascinating, and I would be also very interested to know if any of our listeners or viewers have got ideas of where we've gone wrong.
Yeah.
Other books.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is fertile topic.
Yeah,
Fertile
absolutely.
territory.
And it's very emotive, obviously, because of that's very emotive subject material. So there's going to be some opinions out there, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'd love to hear them, wouldn't we? And then next time we can maybe do something a bit cheerier, like the Black Death.
Or Nazi Germany, for example.
J.G. Vance, His Life and Times.
Let's do it.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I'll look forward to it.
Excellent.
See you then.
See you then.